All right. Well, hey, Scott. Welcome to our first edition of the Winter 21 Rallies Founders Talks. One of the things, Scott, I think I haven't had an opportunity to express to you, but I've maybe an email. But the whole purpose of Rally is that we exist as a social enterprise accelerator to help passionate entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs transform their ideas and existing work into sustainable ventures that create positive social change. One of the things we do believe is that Orlando, Central Florida, can be will be and can be a hub for social entrepreneurship because we have all the right resources and people and networks in this community that will attract international or social entrepreneurs from all around the world. And so obviously you're part of that. You made the cut. We believe that you're one of those people, so I don't mean to put pressure on you, but you're one of those people. And so we're happy to have you here today. So welcome.
Thank you.
Good, good. Well, Scott, let's kind of roll into it, man. I forget where did we meet? Did we meet at a?
We met, Lauren introduced us.
Yeah.
It might have been at one of her Teach for America events back when she was ED or something in that realm, probably 6 years ago.
Absolutely. Okay. Absolutely. Yeah, I remember that because she talked about you at the time. I had an education company that I was trying to get off the ground, it was off the ground. She mentioned that you might be a good person to talk to. So that's how I met you. So it's good that we kept this relationship. I know you recently just moved to North Carolina from Florida, but we still obviously see you as part of the family. Before we get to what you're doing right now, kind of tell us a little bit about Baby Scott. Give us who's Baby Scott?
Baby Scott. So Baby Scott was born and raised in the South. My parents divorced when I was 2, and I lived in suburban Atlanta for the better part of my early childhood with my mom, and went to kind of neighborhood school in Louisiana or in Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And then she ultimately got remarried, and we moved to Baton Rouge, Louisiana when I was 10. And the story of Baton Rouge was one of desegregated but not integrated schools. And so what I mean by that is I went to school with a lot of Black people, but completely separate classes, separate tracks, et cetera. And it was most stark in high school. I went to the original high school for African-American students, founded in 1906 in the heart of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It remained entirely Black until the kind of late 80s. And then they decided to bus some whiter students from some of the more affluent suburbs into that school and call it a desegregated school, and let's all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. But the reality was it was very much a tracked experience. So white students were labeled the gifted students, and had a college readiness curriculum, et cetera. Black students had a very different path. Their teachers were kind of less experienced. The level of rigor that they had in academic classes was not as sufficient, et cetera. And so it was very much the polarization that we see, the opportunity gap, as we call it, in education in a school community, and ironically in a school that was originally founded to empower and uplift the Black community in that particular section of Baton Rouge. So I walked away from that experience with profound questions about race and socioeconomic divide in this country in ways that I just couldn't understand as an 18-year-old. I tried to find forums to ask, but we literally did not talk about it in school, right? Nobody ever talked about that dynamic, that divide, but it was one that loomed large for me. And so ironically, I went off to college here in Chapel Hill. I got out of Louisiana, and my first roommate was a Black guy named Tremaine Hatley. And it was, you're a freshman. He was actually a senior. I was living in the dorms. It was the first time in my life that I actually got to ask all the dumb questions that I wanted to ask in my high school experience about what the hell is going on? Like, why did I experience this? Like, what was your high school experience
So,
like,
so,
et
oh, so
cetera.
you were asking
I was asking him, yeah,
him those
yeah. It
questions.
was like
Oh,
the 1 a.m. conversations over beer that I probably, I wasn't technically allowed to have in the dorm, just being like,
yeah.
dude, like, this was my experience. Help me understand what is
So,
wrong with this country, what is going on with the Black experience, et
so
cetera.
that's before you move forward. That's actually really interesting. Well, there's a couple of things that you said is interesting. One is kind of just funny because I was just having a conversation with my wife recently, and I was just saying, I asked her, did she know any white Tremaines, and she said no. She said Tremaine is if somebody's named Tremaine, probably 99.9% of the time they're going to be black. So it's funny that you brought up Tremaine. And I have a frat brother named Tremaine who happens to be black. But the serious thing is that it's really cool that you were in the proximity of someone who was patient enough and allowed you to be able to have that type of conversation with them, because people can, especially people of color, can fall on either side. Like they either feel like they're not, it's not their job to educate you on it, or they just may not be equipped to properly educate you on something like that, or they have that conversation and then allow you to make those mistakes. So that was like that's a really actually cool thing that you're able to experience.
Absolutely. And it was profound for me in that the story is heading in this direction, which is a deep interest in understanding inequality and education's role within it, and my own journey to try to make sense of the American experience and the disparity in the American experience. And so I
Did
won't.
you go to school to be a teacher or like
No, no,
education?
not at all. I majored in business, right? So,
Okay.
I mean, the I was very much like math. I love math. I want to go make some money. Like, I don't have to be a
Mm,
billionaire, but I'd like to be comfortable, et cetera. So I'm going to
yeah.
go and do something in the intersection of business and technology was kind of what was in my head.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
so yeah, undergrad business, and frankly, didn't even think about education as a path. I thought about it as volunteer opportunities and kind of the thing I do on the side, but I was gunning for consulting jobs out of undergrad. Ultimately, worked at Home Depot's corporate headquarters for 5 years in a business rotational program,
Mm,
and ran a P&L for Home Depot, for a subsidiary of Home Depot in my early 20s. So
yeah.
I volunteered at the YMCA and did some youth development teen programs with a friend of mine in my 20s for about 5 years. But yeah, I was business all the way.
Well, so what was the switch? I mean, going from I want to go make a lot of money uh, at the intersection of business and technology, which seems to point you towards Silicon Valley, or yeah, so that's
Yeah.
probably a place, right? Colorado. What happened? Was what you saw as a childhood and some other events still lingered with you long enough, or did you just kind of, were you intentionally moved into a more um, social direction, or did you just kind of just happen to end up there?
Yeah. So for me, that there are times in your life, and I'm sure people in this call have experienced it too, where you have an opportunity to take a step back and evaluate life and direction and that type of thing. And for me, it was grad school, right? I was 4.5, 5 years into selling blinds and shutters for Home Depot. I was not at all passionate about blinds and shutters. There was no social mission to the work I was doing. I was trying to
Right.
maximize revenue and bottom line, and it was good. I mean, it was intellectually interesting, but it wasn't what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So I did what some people do, which is apply to grad school, and kind of because I had the P&L experience and everything, like made a decently competitive applicant. But the entire time in the application process, I was trying to balance, like, I'm doing this blind and shutter thing, but on the side, I'm volunteering the Y, and working with this really diverse and amazing group of teenagers that are, I would much rather do the volunteer work, and would much rather engage with these students. And I won't go into a ton of detail about that, but it was an awakening for me relative to my own high school experience, where it was a diverse group of kids that came together in a really formative program, and it was magical to me. It was just amazing to see the stark contrast between my own high school experience, which was very much divided, and the one that we were trying to foster at this YMCA with like summer camps and that kind of thing
Oh,
on top of it. So applied to grad school, and I was like, is there a way for me to marry kind of what I like to do, which is like run things and manage program and pay attention to the kind of business side of things with some kind of social purpose that would allow me to get at least a little more proximate to the kinds of things that I enjoy doing on a volunteer basis. And getting into grad school, I got into Harvard, which to me was the dream school. And it just let me take, again, I said, 1 to 2 steps back and evaluate life. And what I realized is from this point, like I can pretty much decide to go in different directions.
mhm.
And rather than stick with home improvement retail, I'm going to use the next 2 years to really evaluate options.
Yeah,
And that was the best advice that I got, which is like, use this opportunity to evaluate options and explore, because never in your life will you have 2 years to really think anew about the trajectory that you're on. And so I did.
yeah, that's really. I was just having a conversation recently with someone about that there come spots in your life where you have the room and the capacity um, to do things and make changes because the environment or the situation allows it, right? And so you just have to be really good at recognizing that. For you, it was grad school. I tell people like the pandemic is one of those things where things got really quiet. And,
Yeah.
and what's interesting is it gave us the space to kind of think about like how do we obviously respond, but then also like what are some of the new things that we could do that could help further the things that we're trying to accomplish. So the fact that you had space to be able to that you use grad school as a space to be able to do that is really cool.
Well, I also I'm just thinking about, you don't seem old enough to have had such a segregated experience of school. And I know that Louisiana and New Orleans, there's a lot of innovation around school, and I'm glad for that now hearing what you're talking about. But it occurs to me that like what the story you're telling about coming out of that high school is probably not the majority of the stories. Most of the people that graduate from a high school system like that don't emerge questioning the racial experience of people in America. They take their experience for granted and run with it. And it occurs to me that like the volunteer thing at the Y is a really interesting, maybe as pivotal as the graduate experience, because it's an antecedent to going to graduate school a little bit. Can you talk about what got you, like what were you thinking? One of the hunches for me is that all of the big steps starts with small ones before that,
Yeah.
and the small ones are sometimes harder to take than the big ones. I wonder what got you over the hump to do that volunteering while you're young professional and going down the career track. You thought you're also like volunteering. What got
Yeah.
you doing that?
Um, so I had my initial response, which is not going to respond to the second question, was, um, but it's a point I think is relevant, which is proximity matters, right? Proximity to the problems that you're trying to solve matters. And so, I mean, I imagine you guys as entrepreneurs know that, but the more you can understand, empathize with, and internalize the challenges that you're trying to solve for, the better the solutions that you create will be. And so, I mean, that was one of the benefits that I had having gone through the experience that I did. Like, I have colleagues that have, gone to elite prep schools and boarding schools and that kind of thing. And, I mean, their high school experience is fundamentally different than mine. I saw, multi-generational poverty firsthand and the impact that it can have in communities, et cetera. So that proximity actually fueled both my interest and my empathy for the students that I'm trying to serve now. And I think that is easily transferable across whatever problem you're trying to solve. That's
Totally.
one, is like that upbringing. And then frankly, the why and my rationale for it, part of it was just like I had my antenna up for doing something outside of my day job, and I was trying to figure out kind of how to use my time. And, you know, I think we have to be selective about the kinds of opportunities we engage in, because you only have a limited amount of time in anybody's day. But for me, it was, I went to an Atlanta Braves game and ran into a friend of mine from college who herself did a massive career shift from broadcast journalism to the thing that she loved, which was running the YMCA. She grew up in the Y and did a lot and benefited a lot from it, and had an opportunity to become the director of youth programs for the local Y. And so she signed up for it. And we just ran into each other, and she was like, hey, I actually would love to have somebody help with tutoring and supporting some of these students I've got my hands full. Would you like to come? So perhaps the lesson is like, you know, it's your network and just seeking opportunity from people around you is sometimes the first step to doing the next thing. I don't know, but that was my own experience, is going to a Braves game, running into a friend, and the next thing I know, I'm going and, you know, spending 3 afternoons a week helping her out.
I love that.
Yeah, no, that's really cool.
Yeah.
So you said, hey, I need to bring all this together, and to take all these skills, talents that you have, and combine it with these experiences and thoughts about how you felt like the world should be, and so what was that first step for you
Yeah.
in making that happen?
So a couple things. I mean, as I mentioned, grad school for me was an opportunity to experiment, and so that's what I did. Right, I actually had a grad school professor who wrote a book called Experimentation Matters, and you know, it was almost before, predated kind of all the you know, there's certainly been a lot of literature and talk about, you know, MVPs and all that kind of stuff subsequently, but at the time, like 2006, like it was pretty eye-opening to me, like this idea of like, you got to experiment to get multiple outcomes and figure out what path to take. And so I actually took that to heart. And so for me, it was like, how many different kind of small experiences can I get to help inform what I'm going to do next? So not dissimilar from kind of thinking about product development these days, but for me, it was like, all right, can I go spend 2 weeks on a volunteer project and kind of work with a company to understand, like, do I want to go on the product side? I spent my summer at Teach for America to try to figure out, do I want to be on kind of the services side of education? You know, I've spent some time at Microsoft because I wasn't sure whether I wanted to do education versus like a pure tech play and a product play, et cetera. So for me, it was just like lots of different at bats to try to figure out what I was interested in. Ultimately, what I came to was that um, I I ultimately thought it would be, I wanted to be a strategist. I wanted to be at 30,000 feet, like the idea of being an investor, a funder, which is ultimately the path that I took, was the thing I wanted to do, but I needed practical experience to get there. And I found a path to be able to do that in a school district. So for me, like coming out of grad school, decided to go and work for 2 years in the DC public school system through a kind of residency program. And the entire rationale there was like, I needed to get proximate to the challenges I wanted to solve and really understand them more deeply before I can try to go and do these, say, the other things, both because I needed credibility to be something different. And I actually didn't feel like I really understood deeply the problem I was trying to solve. So that was the choice I made. And granted, like it was tough, like going to work in a public school system, and you know, I was in the central office. It was being completely and totally reorganized, et cetera. I mean, it was the opposite of entrepreneurship. I mean, maybe you could call it entrepreneurship, right?
Yeah.
It was as bureaucratic could be. It took me like 9 weeks to get a paycheck, et cetera. So
Yeah.
I guess created lots of opportunity to, you know, coming out of grad school, improve process and improve systems and everything. But yeah, the journey was not glorious at all coming out of grad school. It was very much like, let's roll up our sleeves and figure out this industry.
Yeah, I grew up in Northern Virginia, and so I'm familiar with the DC school system and the bureaucracy, and I know people who teach in that system. But that's all school systems, right? And I had an experience where I was a teacher, high school teacher in Detroit, coming out of college, because I was just trying to figure out like what it is that I wanted to do, and so I decided to teach it in the inner city, and I do remember it being um, very challenging because I was a young teacher, and it was rough, and and I wanted to save everybody, right? and and I had to somehow try to maintain control of the classroom, being a younger teacher and inexperienced, and that posed many challenges. And it was heartbreaking to see some of the situations that students were in those schools where, you know, I remember having a student who was 14 and she was pregnant in my class. She was a freshman, right? And thinking about like what her life looks like, and understanding like I'm trying to teach them these students some things, and but they can't learn it because they're too consumed with the things that they bring through the threshold of the doors every day. You know, like how am I going to eat, home life, you know, am I going to have a place to stay? Am I get like those problems were real in that environment. And you saw all these social issues that were coming together in the school that were impeding students' ability to learn, which, as we all know, is a step out of that system. But it's like the pressures of that existence was just cramping that. And so I'm very familiar with that, and I agree with getting proximate to the problem so that you can see it intimately is key to trying to think about and solve it and have credibility around solving it.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you sharing that story. Go ahead.
Yeah. So this will actually take us to something that is relevant to you guys, which is from there, right? You know, I spent 2 years in the DC public school system and felt accomplished. I mean, I felt like we did good work. By no means was it finished. But then a professor from grad school called me up out of the blue one day and said she was leaving academia to go run the K-12 innovation group for the Gates Foundation in Seattle, and was trying to build a team and wanted to see, given that I'd spent several years in a public school system and kind of had an appetite for entrepreneurship and innovation and education, if I might consider joining her on that journey. And so, you know, it was one of these moments where you saw so much challenge and so many opportunities to improve, not just in the individual system in the way that we, you know, supported teachers and that kind of thing, but broadly, you know, there was the resurgence of education technology in schools at the time and beginning to think anew about what role education technology might play. We were thinking anew about process and systems and that kind of thing. And so for me, the opportunity to think like, can I go and influence the system at more of a systemic level? It was for me a really exciting chance to try to figure out how can I go and not myself start something. I actually had notions of maybe I should go start something, but honestly, for me, the red carpet was laid out, so to speak, in life to go do this Gates thing. And you know what I got so excited about, you know, in these initial conversations with the former professor who became my boss was just there's so much energy around these entrepreneurial ideas, these ideas that were just burgeoning in the field. And she was listing off, you know, 3 or 4 in our first conversation. And that captivated me. I was like, what if we could support this person and that person, you know? And so quite literally, it was like Saul Khan, like that was like one of our first investments, our first grants in the space was supporting this like guy that was tutoring his cousins and had some YouTube videos and that kind of thing. And remember, this was like 2010, right? So there's no Khan Academy to speak of, et cetera. And I was like, that's really cool. Like, what if you could like deliver all the world's math lessons online? And there's a program called Teach to One. It was actually called School of One at the time that was based out of the New York City Department of Ed that was like radically rethinking middle school math. I was like, that's cool, that's exciting. And so just these conversations around entrepreneurship was such a stark contrast to the
Yes.
conversations navigating the bureaucracy that I was compelled by that opportunity and went and spent 4.5 years there. So
Yeah, I saw that on your when I looked at your LinkedIn profile. I was like, I had to go one because I still felt like you thought you were managing partner of the next thing you stepped into, but now you're a strategic advisor. Yeah, I saw that and I was like, oh, that's interesting, right? And I can imagine that the energy around that is really was quite different from the public school system. What's so you know, as I listen to you, it's funny because a lot of the things you talk about, like when we look at like the social lean canvas and kind of like how do we move these entrepreneurs through the early phases of an idea to try to figure out product market fit. It is about small experimentations. Well, it is about being very close to the problem, understanding the problem very, very clearly, and then running experiments in very small steps to see like, okay, where it is. And so it sounds like that you actually, I've never thought about a human product marketing, product developing their life, but it sounds like that's exactly what you did. You ran a bunch of small experiments, you got close to the problem, and then you figured out what the solution was, which was you at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And then from there, you decided to take a next step into new schools, right?
yeah.
Yeah, and so like let's because I know I want to get to, you know, just some wisdom that you have around that space that'll be applicable to the founders. But let's talk about that experience, like the jump from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations over to New School. What was it about New School, and then like where are you at right now, and kind of where do you see yourself heading?
Yeah. So at a high level, is a couple of things that drove it. So number one, the the boss that recruited me to the Gates Foundation became the CEO, the third CEO of New Schools Venture Fund. So I followed her there. Just quick context in terms of New Schools itself. It's a 22-year-old venture philanthropy. So if you guys aren't familiar with the term, it basically is early stage venture money to organizations with a social mission. So we support both nonprofits and for-profits. When we support for-profits, it's non-dilutive capital. It's truly a grant to support their social mission, all in the K-12 education space. And so, you know, on our board and our founders, we're venture capitalists, traditional venture capitalists at Kleiner Perkins. So Brooke Byers and John Doerr were the kind of two figureheads of the organization and remain on our board today alongside several others. So it's got this flavor of trying to intersect the VC community with the philanthropy community and try to apply some of the lessons learned from VC to philanthropy. So I can fake it till I make it on the on the equity side, on the VC side. I tangentially interact with those folks quite a bit, but truly I'm a grant maker. I was a grant maker at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I make grants at New Schools Venture Fund, or at least I did until I shifted a month ago into the strategic advisor role. But that's a quick context. We truly make grants to support schools, tools, and people, organizations that are focused in those domains in K-12 education. And most of my work has been directly on the school side, helping to support and launch innovative schools, as well as organizations that are trying to package what really amazing schools are doing and proliferate and grow that to other schools. So that's my core work. The thing, I guess, the salient lesson learned, like follow a good mentor, a good boss. Like Stacy Childress has been amazing in my own trajectory. And I know you guys are on the other side as kind of leaders of your organization, but if I could flip the script a little bit, I'd say good people will follow good leaders. And what she did well was just open up her network, particularly as she was building a team. And in some cases, she was able to recruit people outright. In other cases, she was able to keep the interest warm and let people on their own timeline come and join our team, but just really magical about kind of opening up a network and ultimately forming an amazing team that way, and then convincing people to stay over the years. So that was the main reason. Is boss leaves organization, goes to becomes a CEO, and gives you an opportunity you can't pass up. The other thing is, again, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is great. It's nice to have a billionaire write you a check every year and say, go give this money away. But the idea of going to work for venture philanthropy that is even more proximate to entrepreneurs. I mean, we support early stage social ventures and are able to, I mean, our primary client, so to speak, is the entrepreneur who is launching the thing. And often you're a degree or two of separation away from that kind of person. If you're at the Gates Foundation, at Gates, you're often investing in intermediaries and providing kind of funding there, whereas we don't fund intermediaries. We're directly funding the people doing the work and forming these organizations and helping them grow, which is the sweet spot for me and the thing that I enjoyed the most.
Yeah, that's really cool, man. So you have a lot of insight and wisdom around this space, especially for entrepreneurs, because they are, although they are not education, but they are social ventures who could part of their strategy could be fundraising, right? Let's talk about some of the things, like 3 things that, if you have more, great, but let's talk about, 2, 3 things that you feel like is essential for an early stage social entrepreneur to have in order if they're looking to invest money or looking to attract investment. And then let's unpack those a little bit. So like the first golden nugget of Scott's first golden nugget would be.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you guys already started, which is like, get your pitch down, get the 15-minute pitch or 15-second pitch. And
I said 15 minutes. I was like, that's generous.
Like, I know Kyle and Ben are going through that work with you guys, but it's such a night and day difference between talking with somebody who's fumbling over their words, and even if it's a great idea, it's a palpable difference between those that really have their story down and those that are still working on it. Number 2, like, just quality.
Let's unpack that real quick.
Yeah.
Why is it? What is it? What are the elements of that, and what does it convey about the entrepreneur?
It conveys to me somebody who's spent time and invested in the thing that is pretty obvious. Like, you've got to have your story down, and everybody knows that. I mean, it's common knowledge. And if you don't invest the time to sit in front of the mirror and repeat it 50 times, then you're not doing the hard work that it's going to take to make your business or your enterprise successful.
Gotcha. And then for you, what are some of the elements that you would say that you want to hear in that? Because right before this call, one of the things that we were saying is that I said was that we oftentimes take for granted that the person is going to give us their time, right, and listen through what we have to say, and that's actually false. And so one of the things we should get good at is creating these highly compelling bites that entices the person to get to the next, to ask for the next question, which leads you to the next 30 seconds or the next minute. So for you, what are the elements that would entice someone like yourself or your colleagues?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I'm going to give you anything that you haven't heard, but I mean, you're trying to solve a real problem that you know well, right? That you've thought through the solution and have at least some track record or some kind of demonstration that you have begun to tackle that problem and understand how your solution impacts it. I mean, very, very quickly, I think you can discern, like, okay, problem statement, solution, like, does that make sense? Does the logic flow in that? I think that's one. I mean, just like, for example, right, in education, and I know we're not specific to education, like, it is it it became really obvious to me a few years ago. Everybody was trying to create a new grade book, right? Like half of the ed tech companies that were coming out were a new grade book, and the like surface level knowledge that half of the people that we saw who were coming up with a new grade book had about the complexities of what they were trying to solve was just became so obvious because like there were so many coming at us.
Yeah.
So I use that example to say like, I mean, when something novel came around and somebody actually really deeply understood, like not just their friend who taught for a few years problem, but like truly understood kind of the complexity of the problem they were trying to solve, both for teachers as well as systems, like it became obvious. So that's my quick anecdote. But yeah, you got to understand your problem. You got to have a solution that makes sense. That's as obvious as can be.
Yeah.
The there has to be, or I don't want to say there has to be. I think it is more compelling when there's clear passion behind it, right? Like, and when you can connect either your personal story or the rationale behind it in ways that, it doesn't all have to be tear jerking and that kind of thing. I'm not saying that, but trying to get across not just the why for the product and the problem that it solves, but the personal why, like your entrepreneurial story. That's not going to be possible in the 15-second pitch, but that's eminently possible in the 15-minute pitch. And so, I mean, that just, I think, builds empathy, at least for my work. Like if you're starting a school in a urban community, like I want to understand your personal why. I want to understand what's going to drive you and keep you going. Because it's, the entrepreneurial journey has certainly got its ups and downs, and a personal why, I think will drive you pretty hard in that direction. And then, I mean, the last thing I'll say, like, and you guys, depending on stage, may be too early for this, but I once indexed entirely on the entrepreneur, the individual, and I think that matters a lot. But I also believe team matters a lot as well. And so one of the significant shifts at New Schools that we made was moving away from entirely entrepreneur centric language to talking about team, and acknowledging that it's impossible for one person to have all the skill set, but have you surrounded yourself with both a network of employees, but also advisors and a support system that can help you see blind spots and support you in areas where you need skills. Again, that may stand to reason and that may be obvious, but that's one thing that specifically in the language we use and the way we talk to people, we look for. And honestly, it can be a turnoff if it is so myopically focused on the single entrepreneur and their journey, because honestly, hubris only gets you so far in this work. You're going to need some friends in the support network to get you through.
Yeah, that's really insightful. And you're right. I mean, like we've heard this before, but I think that you can hear things and then different from the same thing, but depending on who's saying it, it carries different weight, right? Yeah. So if my mother got on this call and said these things, every entrepreneur go, yeah, okay. I say these things and the entrepreneurs go, okay. But then you say these things because, you're the money guy. They're like, oh yeah. So no, I appreciate you reiterating, and it's good for me to even hear because Ben and I are working hard to try to get these entrepreneurs in a position where they can create these sustainable ventures that create, that have positive social change. Yeah. And these are many of the things that we're talking about, right?
Before I leave on the funder side, I'd say maybe this is obvious, but I want to state the obvious. So we have a lot of conversations with the organizations, the entrepreneurs we support about funding. And there are a couple just quick anecdotes that I would say. I mean, one is you can certainly, Google search your way to figure out, potential connections, et cetera, that kind of thing. I will say, like, pipeline development and thinking about who you want to get in front of and networking your way into those funders, it can be an individual exercise. There are also lots of people out there who have that expertise as well. And so, trying not to do it all on your own, but really thinking about pipeline and rationalizing who you talk to and figuring out how to network your way in is an art and a science. But it absolutely is something that if you like spend time and energy and get support on, is eminently possible. It is often hard to get your foot in the door, but if you can figure out the networked way to get your foot in the door to different funders, then often the warm introduction goes a long way. You guys likely know that. The other thing I want to say is, there are often no's that come from first conversation, or you just don't hear back, et cetera. Or it feels warm at first, and then kind of the lead runs cold. Stewardship matters a lot, right? And so one of the things, it is a small thing, but with existing funders, like treat them nicely, obviously, right? But the most thing, like, keep them informed, right? Like, they want to know what's going on, and it doesn't take a lot. So I've seen, like, the better organizations in our portfolio that do this well, either send out periodic updates, like, here's what's going on, here's what we're excited about, et cetera, on a monthly or quarterly basis. Even like, rather than thinking I've got to have individual check-ins with each of my funders, like, when you get to a certain level, like having funder update calls and that kind of thing across multiple funders, at least in philanthropy, and I don't want to pretend to speak to the entire venture community, but it's fine, right? Like, I learn a lot and actually get to know and interact with other funders in those conversations, and that's helpful. So for existing funders in that kind of base, like, thinking about regular interaction and keeping them informed and excited about the work you're doing doesn't take a lot of effort, but I think goes a long way to retaining those individuals and convincing them to continue support. But also, when you get to know, there's real value in continuing the same thing, continuing to keep people updated and not letting them. I was just talking to a highly compelling entrepreneur who runs a computer science school in New York and is looking to raise funding for things that are just obvious in his own backyard, like financial literacy and computer science in New York City, like where you would want to go and raise money for financial literacy and to a lesser extent computer science. And I was like, so who'd you talk to, like, early on? Like, where do those relationships stand? And he was like, yeah, I talked to Morgan Stanley and so and so and so and so 3 years ago, but I haven't touched base with them since. And I'm like, if you had regular touch points with those folks over the last 3 years, your odds of securing funding from them now would be much greater than if you let 3 years lapse and then go back and say, hey, you may or may not remember me from 3 years ago. So I know I'm going in probably too much depth, but from a funding standpoint, these are individuals, and maintaining those relationships and keeping them informed matters a lot.
Yeah, I think that oftentimes, well, I shouldn't say oftentimes, I don't want to generalize, but we can get very caught up on the things like, like, oh, if you're going to raise funding, obviously you have to be able to demonstrate product market fit. There's some numbers and things that you have to show that are in place and a model that's in place, but we forget about the relational aspect, and that these are people with lives, and how do you, Ben and I will talk about this, and that it's easier, not all the time is the timing right for me to participate in something, right? But when it's time, what makes it easy is that if I have a relationship with the person and I understand how they work, I've had the opportunity to see how they work, how they're moving, because because at the end of the day, like, I have to trust them, right? Once I assert myself into it or provide my resources to it. And so, like, definitely spending time continuing to cultivate those relationships, and then to continuously demonstrate that you're the kind of entrepreneur who has, you know, the ability to stay with it, that you updating, that, you know, like it gives them glimpses into who you are and makes the decision for them. I feel like when they go to make an investment, that it makes it a slightly easier for them to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, any other nuggets of wisdom? You know, you talked about being passionate. You talked about the why, right? Having the why. The elevator speech, it being compelling. You talked about maintaining a relationship with funders, even as you're trying to get them, and, you know, the mechanism in doing that. Is there any other things that you would want people to know, social entrepreneurs to know at the early stage?
Yeah, I mean, I could probably go on. I would say I want to make sure to answer your questions though. So why don't we cut it there, and I'm happy
Okay.
to respond to that.
Yeah. No, I think that's great, because I think these entrepreneurs probably, you know, they could be thinking about fundraising and they'll have more questions. So better questions than me, because I'm not looking to fundraise right now. All right, so let's open this up for Scott and fellows. If you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and then we can just go ahead and get us started here. Let's change the view. All right, so let's go to Nathan. There you go, Nathan.
Hey, Scott, thank you so much for sharing. When you guys, so even though you're a venture philanthropy, you don't just write checks. Can you talk me through like what that process is for validating kind of your, you know, the pipeline, the due diligence, kind of that whole process?
Yeah, so we have stated strategy areas. So every 3 years we develop a refresh strategy. We tend to continue much of what we've done previously while making kind of mid-flight adjustments, adding and deleting, et cetera. So, for example, we just merged what was once a standalone ed tech portfolio and a portfolio that I managed, which we call model providers. So, kind of still selling products and services into schools, but kind of more holistic than the kind of ed tech products that we've been supporting. So merged those together and came out and developed kind of a new strategy that we put out to both our funders and the kind of broader community around it. So personally, yeah, from a fundraising standpoint in the philanthropic sector, we find that the 3-year strategy, which with a kind of a 8 to 10 page concept note. So this is not a pitch deck. This is like narrative, 8 to 10 page, kind of with some nuance about what you're doing, and kind of included budget narrative within it. Often meets the needs of most philanthropies as a kind of first order business to get your foot in the door and get them get their interest peaked. And then from there, typically have to write additional narratives and respond in whatever format they ask, but it's at least a helpful way to start. So that's at the organization level, 3-year strategy, accompanying concept note, et cetera. As it relates to our diligence process, Nathan, so we have done one of two things. One is we have kind of open application processes, which to me kind of democratizes the process, and kind of allows us to state clearly what we're interested in, and prevents us from being myopic in kind of the networks that we select from among. That's different than some organizations that just try to go within their own network and kind of the degree of separation away from people that know us. So that's 9 times out of 10, that's what we do. We then get a flood of applications, and we try to go out and proactively advertise that as well. Don't just like publish it on our website, but go to networks and proactively seek out entrepreneurs and people who might be interested in applying, to ensure that there's awareness for that kind of thing. Then we go through a process internally of of vetting those applications. I'd say those applications, the questions themselves, are tied to a set of criteria that we've all prioritized internally. So there's kind of a common organizational set of priorities that we care about, but they're fairly basic. So like team is one of them, and we have certain elements that we look for in the team and the entrepreneur, idea, et cetera, financial sustainability and et cetera, are kind of at that level. And then each individual team, based on kind of their specific focus, has more nuanced criteria. We ask questions. The response back is a kind of narrative response in writing to those questions. We then have a vetting process, select, somewhere in the neighborhood of half of those applicants for then further diligence, and that involves typically interview and a deeper dive into financials and strategy and that kind of thing. And from there have kind of a final meeting where the goal is not internal consensus. The goal is that there are champions for the work internally, and nobody is absolutely thumbs down. I don't want to fund this entity. And there's also kind of a portfolio management process involved. So sometimes there are more qualified applicants than there's money available, and so in that case, you have to like pit a few organizations against each other, and ultimately one wins out and the other loses. So that may or may not be exactly what you're looking for, but it is a kind of multifaceted, multi-step process that's intended to get at some certain criteria and then allow for some subjective decision making among a variety of different people internally.
Well, I think what's really fascinating is like we looked at SBIR and we're in phase 2 of the, or we're submitting our NSF kind of for some of the stuff we're doing, but I didn't even think about venture philanthropy. So this is something very novel for me, and thank you so much for your time and your insight, because that becomes, it's very interesting.
Yeah, I think the thing I would impress upon you is not all philanthropy is comfortable making grants or investments in for-profit entities, but some are. And so the first cut of the pipeline that I'd look at is like who has a track record of doing either what are called PRIs or granting for social mission. And there's certainly a subset who are. And then from there, they all have different criteria, et cetera. But I think you are, I would say primary emphasis would be on traditional funders, federal funding available, but don't not look down that avenue either. Because frankly, philanthropic money is often better, particularly if it's non-dilutive, because you retain all the equity, and if you have a social mission, then you can scratch the itch that they have and meet IRS rules to boot.
Yeah, Scott, I want to go back to something you said, because I'm always curious about this when you talk about the balance sheet or the financials of an organization, especially at the early stages. What is it that folks are looking for? Because like the advice out there is like broad, like, oh, people do a 5-year, 3-year, but I feel like if a company's at the very early stage, like as you start getting out of 2 years, it starts becoming BS. And so like, what is it that you're looking for in that section?
Yeah. This is where I have the luxury of being a little squishier than if I were in a traditional VC that was seeking outsized return. So I'll acknowledge that. But what we look for at the earliest stages, honestly, is some demonstration of product market fit, and don't care at all about earned revenue and ARR, to be quite honest. So I basically don't pay attention at all to financials at the kind of pilot proof of concept phase. I look to a degree at total addressable market, right? If they're in such a niche market that has very little opportunity, then I might think twice about it. But for the most part, I'm really looking at do you have a compelling product that the educators and the school leaders that you're that are implementing, do they have positive things to say about it? And do you have an appetite for continued growth, even if you don't have a strategic plan and a growth plan yet? So that's at the earliest stages. So it's much more about product than it is about financials. Then we also support people that are going into the early stages of the growth phase, and do so with larger dollar amounts. For those people, there's this really tricky dynamic, quite honestly, and I don't think it's entirely unique to education, but to some degree it is, which is there's a tension between charging money for product and thinking about open education resources and kind of what do you make free versus what do you charge for, which, there's just philosophical differences among people about that. I don't want to get into too much detail, but basically, if you're not going to charge for your product, then you've got to have some way to generate earned revenue. And I look for people that are open to that, whether it's through a services component or some kind of value added offering, and some demonstration that they can actually generate enough money at least to cover their implementation cost as they grow. And then for those that are willing to charge for their product, again, there's this principal agent problem in K-12 education, which is educators use products, but districts actually buy most products. So if you have a really high priced product, I want some demonstration that you have convinced some superintendents to buy your thing, and that you have an ability to engage in business development in that way and can sell into districts despite their bureaucracy. And then if you're going direct to teachers, that you have a product that is at a price point that actually makes sense for that consumer. And so it's a really kind of nuanced market, but I think the transferable lesson for you guys is like product market fit reigns supreme early on, and then in terms of demonstrating that you have the capacity to generate earned revenue later, like I do think that matters. Different funders have different levels, et cetera. And depending on your industry, you'll know kind of what the threshold is for funding there. For education, like the threshold, frankly, has gotten too high for VCs to fund most of these organizations, so they're in a pickle. Hopefully, you guys are in a position with fintech and some of your other work where you don't have to demonstrate that you have the level of ARR that some of these ed tech providers have to these days. So anyway, I could write a book about that, but let's field more questions. It looks like Marco, you have the next question.
Here you go, Marco. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I just wanted to ask simply, you talked about philanthropic funding and, it's non-dilutive. I guess from a founder's perspective, it's like, sounds too good to be true, but I'd love to know, like, what's in it for the funder? And, is it board seats, or what's kind of the common stake? Because, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right?
Yeah. So here's the way, I mean, the IRS rules are such that as a nonprofit grant making entity, you can make grants to organizations that have a social mission, even if they're not a B Corp, et cetera. I mean, they can truly be LLC, what have you. So there is that stipulation, but it has to align with that organization's mission and have, in Gates parlance, it was charitable purpose was the way that the Gates Foundation was able to do it. They're kind of basic vehicles like actual grants, like truly non-dilutive grants. They're more sophisticated vehicles like PRIs that act more like investment vehicles, traditional investment vehicles. There's a lot of literature that you can look up about that. The most advantageous is grants, right? It is what the funder is looking for in those situations is that this organization, despite being profit seeking, is actually addressing a social mission and has social good embedded within it, right? And so for us in education, Quite literally, it is like you are not only targeting your product at affluent communities that otherwise could afford it, like you're targeting students in underserved communities and have a commitment thereof. And we ask as part of the grant process that a certain percentage of the incremental consumer base that you target, and that as you grow with our resources, you're going to have X percent of students being from underserved communities, being low income, et cetera, et cetera. So it can be a bit of a free lunch, so to speak, at least as it relates to company ownership, but you still have to abide by the rules and regulations of the IRS, and you still have to abide by whatever the philanthropy or the funder wants you to do as part of the grant agreement, or they can pull back your funding per that contract.
So guys, we have time for one more question. Does anyone have anything they would like to ask? Shay? Okay, go ahead, Shay.
So Scott, I'm zooming in a little bit more on ed tech. I come from an education background myself, so a lot of what you were talking about rings true to me. Can you say a little bit more about new ventures and what types of, ed tech can be huge, and is there like particular focus areas that you work in?
Yeah, so we have historically run a series of challenges every 6 to 12 months on areas where we felt the market was underserving teachers and students. So those included early childhood, it included post-secondary mathematics, et cetera. So on our website is kind of a list of those challenges. What we did was kind of a deep dive into those particular topic areas and identify a set of priorities that ultimately became the criteria, or at least part of the criteria for selecting those. So that's, we've been doing that for the last 6 years and have run a series of 5 or 6 challenges out of that, or my colleagues have. So that I think would go into greater depth there. Looking forward, Shay, I would say like in this moment, there are certainly trends within K-12 education that the pandemic has brought on that continue to loom large. I mean, for me, those trends are heightened attention to social emotional learning and trauma-informed care, a focus on how to address kind of acute learning loss or what we say is unfinished learning, students who have truly not received the education that they deserve and that need to catch up, tutoring services and things like that. There's certainly been a rise of more informal schooling opportunities with the pod phenomenon and that kind of thing that you may very well have heard about. And the critique there is that it may be innovative, but is it lasting, and does it have an equity component to it? Does it actually serve students in outside of affluent communities? But thinking about how to address that challenge certainly looms large. And then finally for us, like we still think, despite lots of energy and emphasis, literacy and early literacy, basically the learning to read, remains something that we haven't cracked the nut on. And so we're kind of coming out in our next strategy with a more intense focus on early literacy and the role that ed tech can play. I think the final thing I'll say, like I have this personal belief that, that the kind of a lot of the education technology sector grew up as supplemental tools. They weren't core to the education experience of students. And then you had the rise of lots of core curricular materials that were not technology enhanced in any way. And then you often have professional services and teacher support, professional development that sits outside. And is almost agnostic of both curriculum and the digital technology. So my personal belief is that creating coherence among the various pieces still matters a lot, and it's a real problem to be solved if we're going to actually support student learning going forward. But that's a really tricky nut to crack. But if I could say, like, the main problem that we have, it's not for lack of tools and technology. out there, it's lack of an ability for teachers to create coherence among the pieces and chart a path forward that makes sense and that balances what we want for students, which is to learn how to read and write, but also to experience the world and do projects and get more out of school than drill and kill math. So if we can solve for that, right, with technology or otherwise, then I think we'll have a better system. And frankly, I think that's what the world demands. It's just a complicated and tricky problem to solve.
Well, Scott, my man, listen, you said product market fit your life. If you have space and capacity to do that, get close to the problem, understand it, understand or be able to articulate your why really clearly, put the right people around you. The financials for the early stage, be more worried about product market fit. I mean, you said a lot of good things today, and that I really appreciate the fact that our lives were able to intersect, and you were able to share this knowledge and wisdom with our fellows. And so, although you're up in Tar Heel land now, like I said, you're still an ally. You're still part of the network here at Rally, and we really appreciate you joining us today.
Awesome. Well, I really enjoyed it, and thank you guys.